It's often said that Britain and America enjoy a special relationship. Well, certainly former Prime Minister Tony Blair was very close to President George W. Bush. But how equal is this partnership? And indeed, for some, the word poodle springs to mind when one thinks of Tony Blair. And indeed, his government signed away a sovereign right of British citizens by allowing American legal jurisdiction to apply in Britain. How fair is that? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question, your weekly roundup of views and opinions from the streets of London. I'm Phil Rees. An extradition law with the United States allows a British citizen to be sent to the US for criminal charges, even though the alleged offence may have happened in Britain and was not against British law. Well, before we find out what the public thinks about that, here's a short video clip.
10 years ago, Britain signed a treaty with the United States that became part of the Extradition Act of 2003. The act allows the US to extradite British citizens to face charges under US law, even if they are not charged in the UK. The law is facing intense criticism because a number of British citizens are now being sent to the US to face imprisonment for activities that do not break British law. Richard O'Dwyer is charged in the US for breaking its copyright laws. The 23-year-old student set up a Google-style search engine website which displayed links to pirated material. If found guilty in an American court, O'Dwyer could face between 5 and 10 years in jail. His supporters, as well as the London-based Open Rights Group, argue that he should be tried in the UK since his website was not hosted in the United States. But on January 13th, a UK magistrate ruled that O'Dwyer is to be extradited to the US.
So disappointed that the man can't think outside of the extradition box. Disappointed with this government for signing us up to this treaty, which has opened the floodgates to America to come and seize British citizens without even having set foot out of this country. And that extradition law needs fixing fast.
The 2003 Extradition Act removes the requirement on the US to provide prima facie evidence when requesting the extradition of British citizens, but maintains the requirement on the UK. While the US has extradited 123 British citizens since 2004, only 54 have gone the other way. Once an extradition order has been filed by the US, the UK is also released of its obligation to provide defendants with a fair trial in Britain. This has led to cases such as that of Talha Ahsan, who has been imprisoned in UK jails for over 5 years without trial or charge.
The idea that someone could be imprisoned for years after year without trial by another country they've never been to is just illogical and absurd. My brother's been held longer than people who've had actually been convicted for serious crimes and served their time, and he hasn't actually had a trial or found guilty of anything yet. So.
Despite the promise of the coalition government to reform the extradition laws with the US, there has been little progress amongst diplomatic and political pressure, as well as conflicting interests between an official review of the treaty and a report published by Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights. Many are now campaigning for David Cameron to honour his election promise and repeal the extradition law in order to restore and honour British sovereign citizenship.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking what people knew about extradition law and wondered why, despite his election promise, David Cameron has not amended the extradition treaty with the United States.
Extradition is when one state hands over a citizen to another state for their law and their judiciary and things like that. The cases between the US and the UK seem to be rather biased from my limited reading on the subject.
Do you know what extradition is? And I mean, are you aware of any recent cases involving British citizens?
I do vaguely. There was the NatWest 3 who were extradited several years ago and were imprisoned. And there's a recent case of a businessman who was sold batteries to Iran. But it was a CIA sting job that put him there.
I think extradition is really when someone is sort of forced to leave certain countries to go to another country to fight a legal case.
What exactly is extradition, as you understand it? And are you aware of any recent cases of British people being extradited to the United States?
Well, personally, I don't know anybody, but I think if they are being extradited for a crime, they've always lived here and it's not a crime here, then that seems a bit crazy to me.
Countries have the right, well, they might have the right to try to get people extradited to their country if they break that country's laws.
David Cameron and Nick Clegg, when they were in opposition, said they would renegotiate the extradition treaty with the United States, but nothing has been done. Why do you think that is?
It's probably because of the massively complicated relationship that Britain and America have with each other.
It seems like we don't want to upset America, perhaps.
Because it's probably not in their interest. I'd imagine the US political system is dominant over ours.
Both Nick Clegg and David Cameron, when they were in opposition, said that the act would be renegotiated or repealed. Once they got into power, nothing's changed. I mean, why is that, do you think?
That's one of the million questions you could ask about people once they get into power. What the platform that they present to get into power is not necessarily the platform they're planning to deliver, and we all know that because we see it time and time again.
It's in their interest to be able to deal with citizens that they see as a risk in whatever way they choose, and to have said that they would do that was a very good way to get into office, just like any party will do when it's coming up to an election.
So those are the views of the public here on the streets of London. So let's now find out what our experts have to say.
Extradition is a process whereby one country will ask another to send an individual to face trial for a crime that might have been committed in that country, or to be sentenced to a term in prison if they've already been convicted. Extradition's been in the news lately, especially extradition to the United States, with the case of Christopher Tappan, because it's alleged he's been involved in a conspiracy to export batteries to Iran in breach of a export law. And so it's been very high profile because he's just been sent back to the United States, an extradition order. And there've also been a number of other high profile cases. Gary McKinnon, who it's alleged has hacked into NASA and Pentagon websites in the United States. He actually hasn't gone back to the United States yet, but he's lost a number of legal appeals. There has actually been movement on extradition, and it was really the case of Gary McKinnon which prompted Parliament and government to say that they were going to look into a review of the extradition arrangements between the UK and the US. And what has happened has there's been a review conducted independently via the Home Office. But the review has essentially said that the present arrangements between the UK and the US are acceptable and balanced. And so it hasn't really come up with the answers that those who would like reform were seeking. So the government is in a very difficult position now, because with the extradition of Christopher Tappan, everyone was saying, what's going on? Why hasn't this changed? And government was hoping, essentially, that this review would give them the impetus for reform, but it hasn't. You do not expect in your day-to-day life to be watching out for the laws of another country. And so, in his case, it does seem very unfair and very contrary to our notion of the rule of law, essentially, that you can be charged with breaking the laws of the United States, even if you've never been there. But in the modern world, it seems possible to be able to commit offences on the internet or over the telephone. And so as technology moves on, it seems the reach of the criminal law of other countries is changing as well. So the United States has a number of extraterritorial, what they're called offences now, which operate outside of the United States. So it seems that you and I, the ordinary person, not only needs to be aware of our own law in our own country, you need to be aware of the laws in other countries as well.
There's a principle in law that you are expected to know that the law exists. It's no excuse to say, I didn't know that that crime existed when I carried it out. That obviously makes sense when the law is clear, when you're used to how the law works in the country you live in. Now that we have so much interaction cross borders, particularly through the internet, that becomes a lot more difficult. You could argue that because Richard Dwyer was looking at US programs, he should have been aware that that would attract US law, and he should have been more wary about what he was doing. I understand the case that he would argue would be that in fact he didn't put particular links to cases, to programs at all. He simply advertised that they exist and provided links to other websites. If that's the case, then it's a matter for trial, and this is the problem with extradition. It isn't for the UK courts to try a case here. It's for us to assess whether there actually are valid reasons for the return, if there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate that there has been an offence committed, and that's a reasonable suspicion test about whether there is a case at all. And if there are human rights grounds that they have to look into as to whether there's a reason someone shouldn't be returned because it might breach their human rights. But particularly when you look at whether a fair trial can take place, that often has to be decided in the country where the trial will take place, not in the other country, the extraditing country. So in that sense, it is fair for him to be put on trial in the US because that's where the crime is alleged to have occurred. Whether he should be in prison pending it, there is another issue there, because as a foreigner, arguably he's a flight risk, and all countries, including the UK, tend to treat foreigners in the same way, which is that you have to be in prison pending your trial.
Is it fair that somebody can be jailed in a country they've never been to for doing something that is perfectly legal in their homeland? And after that, when they get sent to the United States, they lose any claim they had to legal aid and have to face huge lawyers' bills. Well, let's find out what the public thinks about that.
I don't think it's really fair, because I consider the UK quite a civilized country, so it can be judged here, because the crime was committed here, right? So I don't think it was really fair. Yeah.
23-year-old Richard Dwyer is a student, and he's wanted in the United States for breaching copyright laws, even though his actions have not broken British law, and he's never even been to the United States. I mean, is that fair?
Of course not. That's not barely a question. No, that's not fair. In fact, I almost don't believe it.
It's true.
That's a setup. That sounds like some kind of deal for ulterior motives. I can't believe that's based in law in this country. That's terrible.
It's sort of a nonsense, really. I mean, if you're in a country that what you're doing is not illegal, I don't see how it should be legal for you to be sent to another country to face trial for something you did that wasn't illegal when you did it in your country.
I think international law is going to become more and more complicated, especially with the internet, I guess, making things international almost automatically.
There's a 23-year-old guy, Richard Dwyer, who's accused of breaching US copyright laws by setting up a site that offered videos and films. He could face up to 5 years in jail in the United States, even though what he did hasn't broken British law. What do you think about that?
If it's exactly how you've just described, that doesn't seem to make any sort of sense. For two reasons. One, if he didn't break a British law, why are America getting involved in a crime that's committed here? But two, because the whole issue around the kind of digital platforms and how they're changing the video environment, that is also up for debate, and everybody's going to have to look at that as well. So there's two issues there, really.
The fact is, America's got more power, and they can kind of, I guess the simple word is bully other states into doing it. I mean, if you went to China, they'd probably break copyright laws in the US all day long.
Once extradited to the United States, the defendant loses any claim he had to legal aid and has to face huge legal bills in the United States. Sort of double whammy, isn't it?
I didn't know that. I thought the legal aid was taken with them to the US. That is a double whammy, and that's very disturbing to hear that. So someone who has, say, no money, like this young guy who's being done for copywriting, how would he get on in that situation?
It sounds awful to be caught up in that, and that some of them will be found not guilty and have been put in prison for years. So, no, it's not ideal at all. It's pretty scary.
I think citizens of any country need to have their rights respected. I don't think anywhere people should be arrested without legal advice or the ability to have their issues addressed in a timely manner. I mean, obviously people shouldn't be sitting around without representation at the whim of another system.
Another factor here, though, is that if somebody is extradited to the United States and they've been in receipt of legal aid, they can no longer claim legal aid. And you know what lawyers cost in America? I mean,
I hear that, but then it's a simple thing, really. You got to think about what you're doing. I mean, if you're going to put yourself in that kind of situation without thinking ahead what the consequences are, I'm afraid you're going to have to accept what's going to happen to you,
I agree that they should be prosecuted under sort of US jurisdiction, whatever. But I think sort of to deny them of assistance from their own country is a bit harsh. Although, I mean, they probably get legal assistance from the US, I would have thought. They're not just stood out there on their own.
Well, different views there from the public. Well, let's now hear from our experts.
It must be very daunting for the person facing extradition to think they're going to wind up in the United States civil justice or criminal justice system without adequate legal representation. And so I think the best alternative, as is being suggested by a number of reformers, is to make arrangements for the person to be tried in the UK with all the appropriate legal assistance that our system provides. And if that's not possible, that they need to be provided with that assistance abroad, and that's something the Foreign Office should be providing and supporting UK citizens faced with these very serious charges in the United States as well. Because we're not talking about large numbers of people. We're talking about maybe 15 people a year that might require this assistance in the US. Human rights are already a part of every extradition request, and so British judges have the opportunity under our Human Rights Act to look at the human rights situation in the destination state, so in the United States. So someone facing extradition to the United States will be able to argue that maybe they won't get a fair trial there, or maybe they have young children in this country, which means that their right to respect for family life would be breached by an extradition resulting in a lengthy trial or a lengthy prison sentence in the United States. But essentially what's happened in the extradition cases is our judges haven't really applied human rights law in a way which has meant any of these human rights arguments have ever succeeded. So it's been a very conservative application of human rights law in the context of extradition, particularly to the United States. And so one of the things that has been suggested by the Joint Committee is that statute gives judges power to change their interpretation of human rights law and to make it easier to make a human rights argument in this context. Diplomatically, it's very difficult to renegotiate this deal with the United States at that level, at the political level. It's very difficult for William Hague to say we'd like to go back on the promises we made. And then that seems to be the real stumbling block, because Parliament is very willing to make the changes, and there's a lot of support in the NGO community as well, and it seems both parties politically would like to make the changes as well, and even the judiciary, I'm sure, would welcome greater independence in this area. But it seems to be politically, diplomatically, the United States said you made this deal and we're not really willing to renegotiate the terms of the deal. So it all comes back to perhaps when these deals are being made, Parliament needs to have greater involvement in the treaty making process as well.
The crime is a crime that's taken place or alleged to have taken place in the other country. UK legal aid doesn't apply because it isn't anything to do with this system. Legal aid is in place for if the rules are satisfied for all appeal stages in the UK concerning the actual extradition. But once a court has satisfied that the extradition should take place, then the UK has no further jurisdiction over the matter at all. It would be necessary for the person to apply for legal aid in the other country, and then the question is, well, is their legal aid system satisfactory? And most countries, it's nowhere near as good as ours is, unfortunately. I think that the Act as it stands is fair, but there needs to be much more work done around the Act in terms of communication between the authorities, looking at whether it really is necessary to issue a warrant when they issue it. Is there more that can be done in terms of investigation? There are now modern technologies available which allow for video conference. It would be quite possible for a person to appear on a video link to a US court. They could be interviewed over that link whilst remaining in this country. They could even remain in the UK until the date of trial, so that they didn't have to spend whoever knows however many months languishing in a US prison. And equally, there ought to be in place the possibility, again through negotiation, of serving a sentence in this country, if that's appropriate. So there's a lot more about negotiation around finding the best way of preventing a person's life being more disrupted than it should.
So does this act diminish the sovereign rights of the UK? Well, a parliamentary committee believes so. The Joint Committee on Human Rights wants the government to renegotiate the treaty. Or maybe the act should simply be repealed altogether.
I think that, the US does have a lot of influence in the UK, a lot of power in the UK. There are many reasons for this, some of which we know, some of which we probably don't know. Ways we're dependent on the US, like militarily and so on.
Do you think then that the US is taking too much sovereignty from the UK in this act? I mean, is that what it really means?
Well, absolutely. From the whole world, the US has the money, they have the power, they control the world. And we are just a lackey dog to America.
No, I mean, I guess not. I think if it becomes a bigger issue, then yeah. But I'm assuming this is affecting a small amount of people. I mean, do you have figures on how many people this affects?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of signs of that. For example, if they want to go and declare war on a state, we somehow make our judiciary quite happy to say, yeah, let's go.
Do you believe that this act, the 2003 Extradition Act, is sort of taking away Britain's sovereignty in any way?
Well, very much obviously is. If that's the case, it's a joke, really, isn't it?
Well, possibly, yes. And there's probably many other things like that reduce British sovereignty. So that's one of the many.
Parliamentary committee, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, has recommended that the law be amended and the treaty be amended. Do you think it should be amended or maybe even just repealed altogether?
I would have to go for repealing. I can't see how that law can work, in any way except the big guy gets what he wants or she wants it. We're not going to be extraditing people to Iran for breaking Islamic law, are we? No, I can't see it.
I think they should amend it. I think to get rid of the Act completely would create other issues as well, whereas it'd be better just to slightly maybe make some amendments instead.
I don't think it should be gotten rid of, simply because, like I said earlier on, if somebody does commit an offence in another country, then it's sort of that issue with that country, not necessarily with their home country. But I think certainly that they need to be more sort of cautious on sort of how they go about prosecuting that person and what kind of defence that person gets.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.